Okay, so the next talk on our agenda is a kind of very special one. We have three guys of ERW here, Friedwart, Heinrich and Nina, and they will present or talk about a very interesting topic, at least from our perspective. It's about developing a metric. Yeah, how secure is your overall Active Directory? And I think that's kind of new, because at least I'm not aware of any kind of comparable metric for that. So Friedwart, Heinrich, Nina, your time on stage.
Thank you, Michael. Welcome to our talk, Developing a Comprehensive Active Directory Security Metric. Our agenda will be this one. After a short introduction with the problem statement and why security metrics, we will focus on how we develop an Active Directory security metric. We will describe where we stand, where we want to go, and what are the lessons learned. Together with me are here two of my team colleagues, Heinrich and Nina, and we all perform security assessments of different kinds. We perform audits, we perform pen tests, we write hardening guides, we write security concepts for Active Directory and Microsoft environments, helping our customers to build a more secure Active Directory. And now, after having this great overview from Sean, I think it would fit quite good to speak a little bit about a possible Active Directory metric. I would like to begin with a short memo. The text of the memo is taken from Pragmatic, what's the title exactly? Pragmatic Security Metrics from Gary Hilson. It's a highly recommended book, and he introduces posing some questions in this memo. Dear John, I'm under renewed pressure from the board to clarify a few things about your budget proposals for the financial year ahead. Please would you address the following issues in writing before the next board meeting. A. We have spent a small fortune on information security in the past 3 years. Naturally, this seemed justified at the time, but it is perfectly reasonable for the board to ask what we have actually achieved in the way of return on investment to date. Can you put a figure on it? Can you demonstrate the value of information security? B. How does our information security stack against our peers in the industry? How secure is our Active Directory, and how secure do we need to be? Some of the more cynical members of the board are starting to express the opinion that we are going for gold when silver will do it. I must admit I have some sympathy for that viewpoint. So, if budget cuts are necessary, in which areas can we safely trim back on Active Directory security spending without jeopardizing the excellent progress we have already made? Looking forward, maybe 3 to 5 years, can you please give us a clearer picture of how the information security management system will pan out? Probably you would say congratulations for this kind of memo. What do you feel as an ISO when you receive such a kind of memo and such requests? A kind of indisposition? Uncertainty, you become headaches. Why? This could be a question. Why do you feel like this? Until now, you probably have, to a big extent, trusted to your gut feelings. Do they help with respect to numbers? That is where security metrics came in place. And with what you feel, the uncertainty, the fear, is because of the lack of knowledge based on numbers you have. And that's the reason where security metrics enter I like the title and I like the book. Therefore, I recommend it, Replacing Fear, Uncertainty and Doubt. Only if you know your state, you will be able to improve it. And you only know it if you are able to measure it in a meaningful way. As Lord Kelvin said, to measure is to know. So that's, from a very, very general point of view, the reason for security metric. You may ask, why Active Directory security metrics? First reason, because it doesn't exist. As to our knowledge, until up to now, there is no Active Directory security metric. Of course, there is the security event log. There are hundreds of thousands of events that might be relevant to some degree or not, but you don't know how to measure them. So our goal is to design a well-defined Active Directory security metric that looks at the crucial security-sensitive measuring points, and that having the crucial security measuring points taken into account tries to measure them in a meaningful way based on numbers, not on gut feelings. I don't want to blame gut feelings, because if gut feelings are based on long experience in your environment, they always are a good indicator. But if you remember the memo, it was not the question for gut feelings, it was the question for numbers. And as we say in German, Zahlen lügen nicht, numbers don't lie. So you have a better chance with numbers. The metric that we are developing is intended for Active Directory experts and personnel. It's not intended for managers. But the important point is, an Active Directory expert with this metric might be able to present something meaningful to managers. So the reason is to get knowledge about the security state in your Active Directory in a comparable and meaningful way. To doing so, we have to go a little bit into the terminology of metric. As the Oxford Dictionary defines, metric is a system or standard of measurement. And the well-known terminology we will use is the measure, to measure for the measuring action. The measuring points are the locations where the measurement is taken, for example, the height of the door. The measurement itself is the value of the measuring action. It is the result of a parameter for something ideally expressed and defined in units, in well-defined units, such as the height of the door is 2 meters. And finally, the measuring instrument, in short, is the device that is used for measuring. Of course, we will adopt this terminology for Active Directory security. Then we found it useful to define key security indicator. That's a term defined by us, and it is adopted from the key performance indicator. But first we thought of using this term, but then we thought that performance measuring at least don't have so much to do with security measurements. Of course, you might be interested in the performance of the replication of your Active Directory, but that's another thing. So we decided to define key security, the term key security indicator. A key security indicator is a number or a percentage. It's a value with respect to a security item on Active Directory. We will give some samples and we will describe where key security indicators might be derived from. They might be derived from findings, respectively their corresponding security best practices. A common security best practice is to have no end-of-life systems in your environment, especially in your Active Directory. So the corresponding key SI would be the number or percentage of end-of-life systems still in use. Key SIs could be derived from professionals' experience as well. A sample recommendation is have a secure configuration of your admin SD holder object, or a secure configuration of your domain object, or a secure configuration of your domain controller object. The corresponding KSI would be the number of accounts with read and write permissions on the object that differ from the default. This could be a good key security indicator. They could be derived from vendor recommendations as well. And one of these recommendations, of course, is to have, if possible, no DCs of your internal Active Directory in the DMZ. So the KSI, most simple, would be number of DCs of internal Active Directory in the DMZ. What are now the prerequisites of a well-designed Active Directory security matrix? First of all, we have to have a good metric. And then, secondly, this metric needs to be well-defined with respect to Active Directory. So, we would like to define what are attributes of a good metric. First of all, the results need to be consistently measured. That is, if you ask two persons of the same environment, the same security question, the answer should be the same. That's often not the case. Therefore, you will probably gather the information via a script that gives the same result. Then, the information that we need together should be cheap together. Cheap together implicates, in our case, that the information can be gathered in an automated way and, for example, with least privileges. If you only need standard user rights to gather a lot of information, that's far more preferable than using admin or domain admin rights. If you want to have domain admin rights, the Active Directory responsible, of course, will ask why. Then, the result should be expressed as a number or percentage and not on a scale. A scale would be, for example, from 1 to 5, and 1 would be very low and 5 would be very high. And you could ask, for example, the operations guy, how good performs our patch management? Could you give me an answer on a scale from 1 to 5? He probably will say, it's a 4. We are not at the best state, but we are quite good. Then you ask the security guy, and he says, it will be only a 3. This is another sample for information that is not consistently measured and that is not expressed in numbers. That is, for example, in systems that have a certain patch not applied. The last criterion is contextually specific. That means the information must say to something to someone who is who works in the area. For example, if the information given would be 50% of our systems have security states lower than the default value. This is a very general information. You can't, what do you do with this information? It's nearly worthless. But if you give the information, 50% of our Windows servers in the US side have UAC disabled. That's already a quite good information, and it's contextually specific enough to say something to the person. Prerequisites of a well-designed Active Directory security matrix are: the measuring points must be chosen very precisely and very carefully. If you look, for example, on the event log capabilities of Windows 10 and Windows Server 2060, you have a tremendous amount of information. You could be literally knocked out by this information. So you have to choose and define very carefully at what security sensitive points you will have a look. For us, as an Active Directory team, that's a good starting point, because we already know where we have to look. But then the real work began, because it's not sufficient to know where you have to look for. You have as well-defined measuring methods. And I will give a simple example. We will elaborate on this later on. How do you measure the security of a UAC configuration? UAC has 10 parameters to be configured. So it turns out, at this point, it turns out to be difficult, and the laborious part of the work began. A short disclaimer, the metric is still in progress. We are not presenting, but we are developing a security metric, and we are not developing a kind of security monitoring framework. This could be a step further on later, but first we wanted to begin with a security metric. So I would like to hand over to Heinrich.
Okay, so in the next section, we want to show you how we approached the development process of an Active Directory security metric. And for you to better understand this, we have to go a step back and look at one specific project that we had before the actual idea of an AD security metric. So one of our customers approached us with the project requirement that we assess more than 50 international AD forests in a way that was quite similar to an Active Directory audit. And from the get-go, some goals and requirements were pretty clear for us. So these were later on also significant for the actual performing of the assessment. So our requirements were that we standardize the assessment methodology as much as possible, so that we can rapidly gather and analyze the information of multiple AD environments. We also knew from the beginning that we most probably won't get direct access to any of the Active Directories that we assessed. And the assessment should take place in a way that we require the least possible privileges. So we don't need to go with domain admin privileges in every single environment, but are only using, for example, standard user permissions. And but at the end, we still wanted to have data that enabled us to meaningfully assess the security level of one Active Directory, and at the end, the security of all Active Directories that we wanted to assess. So you might ask, what does an environment of this size look like? If you remember our talk from last year, we have already shown you the overview. So here you see most of the Active Directory forests and all of the trust relationships between the forests. Like I said, our goals and requirements that we set for ourselves had some very broad and general implications that we had to adhere to during the whole assessment period. So it was clear that we had to define all possible findings, ratings, and recommendations beforehand so that we had more or less a static framework that was applicable to every single Active Directory. And we had to define clear guidelines for everyone that was performing the assessment so that different people would still come to the same conclusions and would identify the same findings and would more or less have the report in the same way at the end. And of course, we wanted to automate as much as possible, just to be most efficient, but also to be very consistent and less error prone. What you have automated and it works in a good way, it will most probably provide the best results. And also with the automation approach, you remove human interaction as much as possible. And the last thing I already mentioned is that we wanted to perform the assessment in a way that we do not need necessarily any high privileges in Active Directory itself. We have seen in the talk before that often the tools or appliances or so that you use in Active Directory often require domain admin privileges, but not for a very specific reason. Okay. Is it coming back? Okay, sorry for that. Yeah, so we wanted to limit the permissions that are needed for actually performing the assessment. And for one, this of course raises the acceptance of the people where we perform the actual assessment. And it also limits the discussion with administrators. Yeah, what were the actual assessed areas that we had to look at? We did not want to only look at the technical configuration of Active Directory, but also wanted to incorporate stuff like the design or actual processes as much as possible. So we had the AD security architecture. We, of course, had the AD security configuration and also AD security processes, which represent your organizational operation. To be able to assess all of these areas, we had to create some tools that would enable us to do so. And the first thing that we did was to create an AD auditing questionnaire so that we could gather information about the operational processes and also about the design in a way that gave us the possibility to come to a meaningful conclusion. And this questionnaire covered 5 areas of AD security that we defined that ranged from the documentation to patch and vulnerability management and to something like monitoring and incident handling. We also developed several AD auditing scripts. All of them were PowerShell based. They, of course, were mainly intended for gathering configurational data from Active Directory and also to a certain degree already interpret the data that we collect. So we ourselves had as less effort as needed to compile the actual report at the end. And in a way, not really a tool, but what also had to be defined were all the findings that could potentially come from the questionnaire and from the script. So from our experience and in discussion with the customer, we defined a list of 34 findings that were later on could possibly be in the reports. And half was from the audit script and half was from the questionnaire. And the findings themselves were predefined, but at some points it was necessary to modify it slightly so that it better represented the Active Directory that we assessed. The presentation of the results was quite basic. We had a traditional report for every AD environment where we had the typical parts of a report, the management summary, all identified findings, of course, ratings for every finding and also the recommended controls. In addition, there was also an Excel file which consisted of basically the same information but with some additional infos like statistics, which domain had the most findings and something like that. And we also had an overall report which tried to aggregate all of the results we had up until this point, and also some graphical representation of all of the findings. So what have we learned from this project for ourselves at first? It was that the assessment and the report, of course, greatly benefited from this standardized and automated approach. But later on, we also realized that some characteristics of a good metric were already met by this approach. So the data was cheap to gather because we used a quite basic questionnaire, which was complex in the evaluation, but a questionnaire in itself gives you data rather easily. And also the script being in this case only run with standard user permissions also gave us a possibility to cheaply gather Active Directory security configuration data. And what we also realized later on, that in great parts the results that we are collected were also consistently measured, which is also a characteristic of a good metric. Because if we run a script, it gives us the data that we need. This is already consistently measured. So, but we also had to realize that the traditional assessment in the style of an audit has some inherent problems if we look at the direction of security metrics, because the findings were more or less treated independently. In the management summary, you of course try to correlate the findings and present them in a way that they play together well. The ratings for the findings are quite subjective. If you use a traffic light scheme, for example, what is the actual difference between a low and a medium rating? It is based on the experience of the security professionals that perform the assessment, but it's quite hard to measure in the context of a security metric. The reports, in turn, were also interpreted by the client or by the customer, so this could potentially lead to some misunderstanding. If you have very specific numbers that give you an indicator for something, it is less error-prone to such misunderstandings. And what we also often see is that the customer takes parts of the report or of some other result documentation and gives only parts of the report to specific persons. And this can also lead to the problem that the people cannot make sense of this part they received on their own without the knowledge of the whole document. And one of the biggest downsides that we have identified over the time of this project is that the results did not really allow for a direct comparison of the different ADs. So you of course had numbers like how many findings does this AD have, how many findings does this AD have. You could compare them, but do more findings automatically mean that it is in a worse security state? If you have only a few findings but with a very high rating, does it equal a lot of findings with a low rating? So it was very hard to compare. And at this point, the idea for an AD security metric was born. And in the next part here, we want to show you how we actually came from the results of the project and the lessons learned from the project to the actual security metric. Because we did not want to start at zero. We have seen that we already have something that can be reused for a security metric. And the idea then was to translate the audit findings into security metrics. And but audit findings, I already mentioned some of the problems. Audit findings do not work that well in the context of security metrics. The results are not always consistently measured. If you have a questionnaire and there's a user-defined text field, how do you measure this in a consistent way? In this text field, there could be anything. The results are not always expressed as a cardinal number or percentage. If we come back to the ratings, we have something like low, medium, high. these are only qualitative labels, but what exactly is the difference between low and medium, medium and high, and so on? And this is also a problem of the next thing that stands on here. Results are not expressed using at least one unit of measure. If you have a qualitative label, it has no unit. It's just a word in this sense. And yeah, so we had to define a process for the correct translation. Here we have an overview of this process. We begin with our findings that we have defined before. And from these findings, we abstract the actual underlying security problems. These are very general, very broad at first. It serves the purpose for us to better understand what the actual problem is with this finding. And on the other hand, we also abstract one or more measuring points. When we performed the assessment, we already had to know where we have to look at to identify if this is a finding or not. So in a way, we already had our measuring points that are necessary for a security metric. And from the security problems, we then have defined well-defined security questions, which at the end will lead to our KSIs. And if you measure your measuring points, you of course receive some sort of measurement. And the security questions you then try to answer with your measurements. And in many cases, this is not possible after the first definition of your security questions and measuring points. So you have to reevaluate both. You have to look at your questions and you have to look at your measuring points. And at the end, if it works out and you can answer your security questions with your measurements, you have your KSIs. This is a very abstract definition of the whole process. And all that you see on the left and at the bottom, this is the actual security metric that you develop. So I will go quickly through some of these steps. So with the measuring points, like I said, you abstract them from at the beginning, from the audit findings, because you already had some idea of how do I identify if this is a finding or not. And one finding can result in one measuring point, but it can also be multiple measuring points. And the measuring points are then in turn measured with your so-called measuring instruments, like we heard before in the definition. And this is your actual device or tool which give you measurements from your measuring points. So here on the slide, you just see a few examples what measuring instruments could be in AD. So scripts, questionnaires, interviews, the actual documentation. It could be monitoring tools and also that everything that comes from event logs. So you have a lot of tools already at your disposal to work in the context of a security metric. And if you perform your measuring process, you of course have your measurements. And every measuring point can have one measurement, but it can also have multiple ones. And some measuring points have a predefined set of measurements. Think of a GPO setting, for example, that can be enabled or disabled. At the end, you only have a set of 2 possible options, and you know that beforehand. This can be very important for analyzing your data later on. And the most crucial part is that you have very well-defined security questions which can result in relevant answers. Without these relevant answers, you cannot have your KSIs in place. And like I also said, security questions can be answered with one or more of the measurements. But you have to keep in mind that not all security questions can be answered with the measurements you get directly from your initial measurement of a measuring point. That's why we have defined several levels of measurements, you could say. The initial measuring point, if it does not give you the answer to your security question that you have posed before, it requires a mathematical or logical operation to come to your second measurement. So we have called them primary and secondary measurements. And if this is still not sufficient to answer it, you can repeat the process. And what is also very crucial in developing a security metric is to reevaluate your measuring points and your security questions. Because if the security questions cannot be answered in a meaningful way, this can be due to two reasons. Either your security questions are not precise enough or just wrong. You do not ask the right questions. Or the selected measuring points are not sufficient or, again, are just wrong. So in an iterative process, you have to reevaluate both and at the end then have more or completely different measuring points, or you have a reformulation of your security questions. Now I will hand back to Friedwart. He will explain this in one specific example.
So we would like to go through one example, and the example is still nowadays in most organizations heavily discussed security setting, that is the LAN manager authentication level. Interestingly, Jesper Johansen, one of the Microsoft security guys some years ago, who wrote a lot of interesting articles, wrote one in which he talked about precisely this set of settings and named it as the most misunderstood security setting ever with respect to Microsoft environments. So we had the following audit finding defined: insufficient LAN manager authentication level on multiple systems. The underlying security problem is that an insufficient LAN manager authentication enables for the use of NTLM v1 and LM authentication protocol. We rated this security setting on a scale from 1 to 5, from very low to very high, as high. Now, if we want to go through the process, we have to abstract from the finding to the measuring points and the measurements. So the setting LAN manager authentication level, this finding you find in a GPO. The first measuring point is the GPO where this finding is defined. And the second point is the location where this GPO setting is linked to. Of course, you might have different GPOs that set this setting on different values. Then you have the set of measurements, and in case of a Windows system is acting as a client, then send LM and NTLM responses is the lowest setting, and send NTLM v2 response only is the highest setting. The finding was triggered when the setting was set below to send NTLM v2 response only. So if you look at the security problems behind the finding, you might have to come out that there are more than one security problem. The first security problem is that outdated authentication protocols are in use. That is LM and NTLM v1. But the connected second security problem is that that outdated hash, such as the LM hash, are in use. Because if you use the LM authentication protocol, the LM hash will be used, or not NTLM v1 or v2. So we have two security problems behind this finding. And then, of course, we could ask as well if there shouldn't be any differentiation between LM and NTLM v1. Now, we can define the security questions out of the security problems. The relevant security questions in this case would be: what percentage or number of systems do we have that may support LM hashes? What number do we have that may support LM authentication, and which number do support NTLM v1 authentication? Looking at this, we may ask if the measurement and the measuring locations are able to fully answer the security questions. I would translate this. does the use of LM hash depend only on the send NTLM v2 response setting? I could ask this, the audience. No, it does not. Other factors come into play. For example, the operating system version. If you use Windows 8.1 and above, the LM hash will simply not be generated. If you use a strong password policy with a length more than 14 characters, LM hash will not be generated, although the group policy setting allows theoretically for the use of LM authentication protocol. So we have additional factors influencing the patch level as well. This is quite tricky. If you think of a Windows 7 system, a fully patched a Windows 7 system that has all security patches will generate still the LM hash, unless you apply a certain patch that is not rated as a security patch that will backport the possibility to not generate the LM hash from Windows 8.1 to Windows 7. So we have to take into account that we will need more measuring points and measures in order to answer fully our 3 security questions. And these are the attribute on the computer of the computer object, the operating system version, questions regarding the patch management in the questionnaire, the GPO setting, minimum password length, and where these GPOs are linked. We have an overview of this process in the slide, and the important point is that starting from the finding, abstracting the security problems, formulating the security questions, and then you have to ask yourself, do the measuring, the original measurements and measuring points, do they answer the security questions fully? We detected that's not the case, that we have to take into account further measuring points and measurements. So finally, we could derive for now 3 KSIs, and these KSIs are number of systems that may support LM hash, number of systems that may support LM authentication and NTLM v1 authentication. And if you oppose this information to the information of the original finding that is insufficient LAN manager authentication level on multiple systems, you see that this information is quite more precise in the sense of what makes a metric. If we evaluate this, the information, as you already know, is consistently measured and chipped together. It's expressed as a number, a cardinal number, or a percentage. It's expressed using at least 1 unit of measure, that is the system that uses, for example, LM hash, and it's contextually specific. That is, it says something to an AD admin. But we find as well some obstacles, and there I will hand over to Nina.
So after now the process was described that we followed, I will now talk about the obstacles that we guarded. Okay. These obstacles always start with the same problem. We were asking the wrong questions. Asking the wrong questions led us to getting lost in the data we gathered, and then trying to fix the unfixable. I will go through an example to make this clearer. So the audit finding user account control disabled on multiple systems, which had the underlying security problem that any application started by an administrator runs in the user and privilege context of the administrator. What the audit finding I started with the question, how good is the UIC configuration in the environment? This is not a good question because it's not specific. And a good question should be answerable by a KSI that conforms to the criteria of a good metric. But you cannot put any measuring unit, for example, after in an answer, how good is it? So this is an Excel spreadsheet where I tried to get ahead of the data we had. On the left side, you see all the settings that apply to UIC. Then you see the possible measurements that could be derived from this, and then parameters I assigned to this. You see there that I was not able to fill everything, to put everything in, because you see empty spaces on the right side. And you see like strange numbers like 0.5, 0.75, and so on. I will explain how I came to these numbers and why this was a bad idea. So from these parameters, I tried to do an algorithm. There again, you say like strange numbers, 0.8, 0.2. Also, I come back later to this. This algorithm I put into a bigger one to assess the whole environment. And I still did not consider every measuring point because I didn't know how to. The problem was that there are 10 GPO settings relating to UIC, and they all kind of are important in assessing how good the UIC is. But that is the wrong question, like I said before. So I wanted to put them all in like one algorithm. These measuring points mix different aspects of UIC. So how can I connect these resulting measurements? And they have qualitative differences between the different measurements. The set of measurements is just like a qualitative difference. It's like an ordinal scale. Yeah. So how do I quantify this? Like you saw before, I did not go back and reconsider the taken approach. I applied an algorithm with weighings. So I weighted, I put a weight on things like, okay, prompting on secure desktop is not as important as having UIC disabled, so I say it's 0.2 of the importance, or I weighted inside the ordinal scale, I put weight on it and said, okay, if you have it for everything besides Windows binaries, UIC disabled, it's like half as good if you are following security best practices. So I got back to gut feeling, the thing we wanted to get out of the problem. Still sounded good to me until I tested it. So it's consistently measured and cheap together, and yay, I have a cardinal number of percentage as a result, but it's not expressed using at least one unit of measure because there is no unit of measure, and it's not contextually specific because it doesn't tell you anything, actually. So how to make it better? Always have the criteria of a good metric in mind on any step of the way. Posing the appropriate questions with the real art of information security, also from the book Pragmatics, is the one thing you should always have in mind. Go back to your question and adjust your question. And select your measuring points according to your questions and not the other way around. Don't go through the information you have and think, oh, I want to put this in. Think what you really need. This might lead to questions not being answerable or not answerable with your data. Then change the measuring points or your measuring instruments. How would I have made it better? There are some things you can ask sensible. It's like the percentage of system where UIC is not enabled. Then you have to also put other things into account to derive the KSI, like the attribute computer operating system version, or on how many systems in the environment UIC is configured according to security best practices. If you have these two question answers, you can go further and ask, okay, if UIC is enabled but not according to best practices, what are the main derivations? So you go back and use it as an ordinal scale. You make an algorithm on an ordinal scale, which you're allowed to do. actually. So now, where do we stand? We had 34 original audit findings, over 200 measuring points. We have now just 22 KSIs, which are sufficient to be a good metric, and we're working on 16 more. Where do we want to go? Of course, more and broader security questions should be answered with this. So we want to define more KSIs and use these KSIs as measurements to answer broader questions again. Then we want to include more measuring instruments to get access to more measuring points. And in the end, we would like to test our metric for construct validity to assess if it really assesses the security of an ID. Therefore, we have to define external factors, and that's a hard thing to do, so we're not sure how to process with this. Getting back to Friedwart.
So, what are our lessons learned? First of all, doing metrics is quite hard. At the beginning, we thought, oh, of course, we are in a good positions because we know where to look. But then, when it comes to metric and how to really measure things in a consistent way, it's getting hard. Therefore, we considered other areas where the application of metrics is far more involved than in information security, especially in Active Directory. As Nina already said, posing the right questions is crucial, and keep always in mind that if you are stuck to something and don't succeed, keep in mind what are good criteria for metrics and try to apply them on your security questions, measurements, and measurements locations. Please stay or get in contact with us. Help us to develop an Active Directory security metric in order to be able to finally measure Active Directory in a progressive sense. If you follow us on Twitter at Directory Ranger, and so far, thank you for your attention.